Welcome back to another episode of the Lord of the Rings AMA podcast. My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I invite you to ask me anything about Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or anything related to the greater legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I will do my best to give you as in-depth an answer as I can. Now, we're not going to start with any announcements this week, because we have a lot of ground to cover today. Because we are going to continue answer Brian McKenzie from Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada's question. And as a reminder, Brian asked, can you tell us about the rise and fall of the hidden city of Gondolin and how its legacy impacted the Lord of the Rings? And so last week we answered the first part of the question, the rise of Gondolin. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, I would highly recommend that you do. But for those of you who did listen, but you want to recap, well, here's where we left off. Turgon, at the urging of the Vala Ulmo, moved his entire population to a hidden city encircled by mountains, and there he founded the city of Gondolin. And Turgon was told that this would be the last refuge for the elves in the event that Morgoth broke the siege of Angband, but that he shouldn't rely solely on his own strength, and to remember that the only salvation for the elves of Middle-earth would come from the west. And Ulmo also instructed Turgon to leave behind a special suit of armor, which Ulmo said would be worn by his messenger as a warning when Turgon should abandon his city and seek help from beyond the sea. But for several hundreds of years, Turgon and his people lived in peace in Gondolin, hidden away from the world. Now, there was some tragedy when Turgon's sister Eredhel disappeared, then reappeared about 75 or so years later with her son Maeglin, being pursued by her husband Eöl, and Eöl attempted to kill Maeglin, but Eredhel sacrificed her life to save him, and Eöl was put to death. And Maeglin was welcomed into Turgon's household, but he became infatuated with Idril, Turgon's daughter, and, coincidentally, his own cousin, which freaked Idril out, and Maeglin's thwarted desires turned to bitterness in his heart. And that was the fast version, so seriously, if you didn't listen to last week's episode, you gotta go back and check that out. But we'll move on from there. And despite the tragedy of Eredhel's death and Maeglin coming in and kind of starting to poison the system there, life in Gondolin really was peaceful. And arguably, it was the best place to live in Middle-earth. But the world outside the peace of the hidden city continued to move on, and the evil of Morgoth never slept. Now, two major events would soon shake the tranquility of Gondolin. The first is the arrival of men into Beleriand. I talked about this a little bit last week, but essentially there were three houses of men who allied themselves with the elves. The House of Beor, the House of Haleth, and the House of Hador. And we're going to get some more on them soon, but I am also going to put like a family tree of these houses into the show notes, just in case you want to see how they all connect, because they all do. They all interconnect with each other. And that was the first main event that sort of started to shake up the world, men appearing in Beleriand. And the second major event was the breaking of the siege of Angband in the fourth great battle of the First Age, the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, because honestly, I think that the great battles of the First Age could be their own episode. But essentially what happened was that, without warning, the triple peaks of Thangorodrim, which towered over the underground fortress of Angband, exploded in fire, and an army built in secret rushed forward, led by Glaurung, father of the dragons, Balrogs, and thousands of orcs. And the forces of the Noldor were defeated on all fronts, though they were able to create strongholds of resistance. So the sons of Feanor, they were scattered, with some taking refuge in the other hidden kingdom of Nargothrond, others building their own fortress. And then two of the sons of Finarfin, brothers to Finrod, king of Nargothrond, and Galadriel, their names were Angrod and Aegnor, and they perished. And Finrod himself would have been killed had he not been saved by a guy named Barahir of the House of Beor, who rescued him and allowed Finrod to escape. And as thanks, he gave Barahir his ring as a symbol that the House of Finrod would always aid the House of Barahir. And as a side note, Aragorn still has the Ring of Barahir in The Lord of the Rings. And as a second side note, Barahir was the father of Beren, one of the key figures in one of the other great tales of the First Age, the tale of Beren and Luthien. And after a year of war, the High King of the Noldor, Fingolfin, believing that all was lost, got on his horse and he rode through the armies of the orcs, and he reached the doors of Angband, where he challenged Morgoth to single combat. And he lost that fight, but not before wounding Morgoth, the only elf to ever achieve such a feat. And Fingolfin's body was retrieved by the great eagles of Manwë, led by their king Thorondor, and they carried it to Gondolin, where Turgon built a cairn for his father. And with that, the kingship of the Noldor passed to Turgon's older brother, Fingin. And we are told that war never ceased wholly ever again in Beleriand, but the Battle of Sudden Flame is held to have ended with the coming of spring, when the onslaught of Morgoth grew less. Thus ended the siege of Angband, and the foes of Morgoth were scattered and sundered one from another. And after this, orcs just began to start raiding throughout the land, and they raided further and further south. And there came a time when they started raiding the people of Haleth, which are also called the Halidin, and there was battle in their woods, and many people died. But two brothers, Hurin and Huor, who were living with the Halidin, though they were of the House of Hador, and they were protected from the orcs by Ulmo, the Vala of the Waters, who raised a mist from the river Sirion to hide the boys. And so they got away from the orcs, and they wandered for a time and got lost beneath the mountains that encircled Gondolin, until they were seen by Thorondor, who sent eagles to lift them up and carry them to Gondolin. And in Gondolin they were welcomed by Turgon, who took them in, and he raised them as members of his own house. Hurin and Huor came to love the city of Gondolin, and they learned much from the elves. But after about a year, they asked Turgon if they could leave, because they wanted to be with their people, and because, unlike elves, they were mortal, and they didn't want to miss out on an opportunity to achieve glory in the fight against Morgoth. And Turgon, he was reluctant, but he said that he would allow them to leave as long as, 1, they left the same way they arrived, carried by the eagles, and 2, they needed to swear that they would never reveal where they had been. And Maeglin, he's watching all of this with bitterness, and this is what Tolkien writes in the Silmarillion. But Maeglin, the king's sister-son, who was mighty in Gondolin, grieved not at all their going, though he begrudged them the favor of the king, for he had no love for any of the kindred of men. And he said to Hurin, "The king's grace is greater than you know, and the law is become less stern than aforetime, or else no choice would have been given you but to abide here to your life's end." Then Hurin answered him, "The king's grace is great indeed, but if our word is not enough, then we will swear oaths to you." And the brothers swore never to reveal the counsels of Turgon, and to keep secret all that they had seen in his realm. And they did, for the most part. We're now going to enter a point in this story here where the three great tales of the First Age all just get mixed up together. And in order to not do a 4-hour-long episode, I'm only going to pull out the relevant bits to tell the story of Gondolin. And so the first is the tale of Beren and Luthien. And the main thing you need to know is that Beren, son of Barahir, and Luthien, daughter of King Thingol of Doriath, they broke into Angband with the help of a massive talking dog and stole a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth. And a whole series of events happens after that. People die, they're brought back to life, it's a whole thing. But the point is, the Silmaril ends up in Doriath with King Thingol. Now, the sons of Feanor, they were not thrilled about this, but remember, they had sworn this unbreakable oath that they wouldn't rest until they had regained the Silmarils. But the eldest, Maedhros, he was encouraged because it showed that Morgoth wasn't invincible, and he could be thwarted. And added to this was an influx of men that had newly arrived into Beleriand, which he hoped would join in the fight against Morgoth. And so he formed a plan of attack, where King Fingin would attack from the west with his allied men, while the sons of Feanor would attack from the east with the dwarves of Belegost and the newly arrived men. They were under the House of Uldor or Ulfang or something like that, the new ones. And they sent messages to Doriath, asking King Thingol to come aid them, but Thingol hated the Noldor, so he just refused. But 2 members of his house did go, and they feature in the second great tale, The Children of Húrin. And so then eagles carried word of the plan to Turgon in Gondolin, and for the first time in over 350 years, the elves of Gondolin left their hidden valley, and Turgon led a force of 10,000 soldiers into battle with Maeglin at his side. And nobody knew that Turgon had received this information, so his appearance was a cause for great joy amongst the elves. Unfortunately, that joy would turn to sorrow, and the battle that followed would later be called by the elves the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, which means the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. You see, Morgoth was prepared for this attack, and he had a much larger force than they expected, and the battle wasn't well coordinated, but even with this working against the Noldor, the failure came when the men, under the command of Uldor, betrayed the sons of Feanor and attacked the rear of their forces. And the resulting chaos led to a rout of the elves, and many of the leaders perished. King Fingon was killed when he was surrounded by Balrogs, and the sons of Feanor were scattered. With his brother dead, Turgon was now the High King, and he began the slow fighting retreat from the battlefield. With him in the fight, he was actually joined by Húrin and Huor, and the people who had been fighting with Fingon. And Tolkien writes what happened next. The field was lost, but still Húrin and Huor and the remnant of the House of Hador stood firm with Turgon of Gondolin, and the hosts of Morgoth could not yet win the Pass of Sirion. Then Húrin spoke to Turgon, saying, "Go now, Lord, for in you lives the last hope of the Eldar, and while Gondolin stands, Morgoth shall still know fear in his heart." But Turgon answered, "Not long now could Gondolin be hidden, and being discovered it must fall." Then Huor spoke and said, "Yet if it stands but a little while, then out of your house shall come the hope of elves and men. This I say to you, Lord, with the eyes of death. Though we part here forever, and I shall not look on your white walls again, from you and from me a new star shall arise. Farewell." And Maeglin, Turgon's sister-son, who stood by, heard these words, and did not forget them, but he said nothing. And so then Húrin and Huor, with their men, they bought Turgon the time to escape with his troops, and they return unseen to Gondolin. And last of all the men fighting, the 2 brothers stood alone. And I'm going to read this next part because it's one of those quintessentially epic Tolkien moments that kind of just gives you chills. "So it was that Turgon fought his way southward, until coming behind the guard of Húrin and Huor, he passed down Sirion and escaped, and he vanished into the mountains and was hidden from the eyes of Morgoth. But the brothers drew the remnant of the men of the House of Hador about them, and foot by foot they withdrew, until they came behind the fen of Serech, and had the stream of Rivil before them. There they stood, and gave way no more. Then the hosts of Angband swarmed against them, and they bridged the stream with their dead, and encircled the remnant of Hithlum as a gathering tide about a rock. There, as the sun westered on the 6th day, and the shadow of arid Wethrin grew dark, Huor fell pierced with a venomed arrow in his eye, and all the valiant men of Hador were slain about him in a heap, and the orcs hewed their heads and piled them as a mound of gold in the sunset. Last of all, Húrin stood alone. Then he cast aside his shield, and wielded an axe 2-handed, and it is sung that the axe smoked in the black blood of the troll guard of Gothmog until it withered, and each time that he slew, Húrin cried, "Aure Antaluva! Day shall come again!" 70 times he uttered that cry, but they took him at last alive, by the command of Morgoth, for the orcs grappled him with their hands, which clung to him still, though he hewed off their arms, and ever their numbers were renewed, until at last he fell buried beneath them. Then Gothmog bound him, and dragged him to Angband with mockery. Thus ended Nirnaeth Arnoediad, as the sun went down beyond the sea. Night fell in Hithlum, and there came a great storm of wind out of the west. And what became of Húrin is the subject of the second great tale, The Children of Húrin, and it will briefly intersect with this story in a bit. Most of our concern is with the child of Huor, because when he left for war, his wife, Rian, was pregnant with their child, a son she named Tuor. So Huor and Tuor. The area of land that they were living in was once the realm of Fingon, but Morgoth filled it with those evil men who had aligned with him, and they treated the people of Hador terribly. And so Rhiann fled, and she met some elves in the wilderness, and she gave them to Tuor to foster, and went to search for Huor's body. And Tolkien says that where the bodies of those who died in the fight against Morgoth were piled up, green grass grew on the mound, the only green amidst a ruined field of battle. And when Rhiann found the hill, Tolkien says she laid down upon it and died. Now, I mentioned in last week's episode that this is the least fleshed out of the three great tales. And the bit that Tolkien actually did write has to do mostly with Tuor's childhood and his journey to Gondolin. And I'm actually not going to get into most of that because it's a lot of him walking through valleys with rainbows and following swans. If you want to read about it, I'd highly suggest the last book Christopher Tolkien published, The Fall of Gondolin. Anyway, while Tuor was growing up, being raised by elves, Turgon in Gondolin was remembering Ulmo's words to him from like 400 years before, about how the only hope for the elves would come out of the west. And so in secret, he began sending mariners down the river Sirion to the sea, where they met with Círdan the shipwright, and there they built these ships to sail to Valinor in order to plead for the case of the elves. And none ever reached the far shore, because the ban of the Valar could not be overturned, and only one sailor ever returned. Now, jumping back to Tuor, he grew up, he was captured by the evil guys for a bit, he escaped, he lived as an outlaw, and then in his wanderings he eventually found his way to Turgon's abandoned hall of Vinyamar in Neverast. And inside he found the armor and the weapons that Turgon had left behind, and finding that they fit him perfectly, he puts them on. And he goes out to the sea, and there Ulmo himself rose up from the seas, I believe making Tuor the first mortal to ever speak directly with a Vala. Beren might have, but he would have been dead at the time, so I don't think it counts. Anyway, Ulmo commanded Tuor to seek out the hidden city of Gondolin and give a message to King Turgon. The next day, Tuor comes across an elf who had washed up on the shore, named Varanwe, and he had been the captain of the last ship that attempted to sail to Valinor. And so Varanwe, he sees the armor, he sees that he's got a message from Ulmo that he needs to bring. So Varanwe leads Tuor to Gondolin, where they pass through the 7 gates that protected the city. And this is where Tolkien stopped in his rewriting. And the rest of the story is just sketches, which is a shame because it's the coolest stuff. So this is what Christopher Tolkien put in the Silmarillion. Thus it was that the son of Huor rode across Tumladen, and came to the gate of Gondolin, and passing up the wide stairways of the city, he was brought at last to the tower of the king, and looked upon the images of the trees of Valinor. Then Tuor stood before Turgon son of Fingolfin, high king of the Noldor, and upon the king's right hand there stood Maeglin his sister son, but upon his left hand sat Idril Celebrimbor, his daughter. And all that heard the voice of Tuor marveled, doubting that this were in truth a man of mortal race, for his words were the words of the Lord of Waters that came to him in that hour. And he gave warning to Turgon that the curse of Mandos now hastened to its fulfillment, when all the works of the Noldor should perish. And he bade him depart, and abandon the fair and mighty city that he had built, and go down Sirion to the sea. And yet despite that warning, and despite the fact that Ulmo had told him, "Love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart, and remember that the true hope of the Noldor lieth in the west and cometh from the sea," Turgon could not bring himself to leave the city that he had built and loved so much. And he knew it was still hidden from Morgoth, so instead he just secured the entrance of the valley, blocking it off so that no one could use it. And within Gondolin, Tuor prospered in the city, and he and Idril fell in love. And Turgon favored Tuor so much that he allowed them to be married, making them only the second marriage of man and elf, with Beren and Luthien being the first. And this really, really pissed off Maeglin. And Idril gave birth to their son, Eärendil, which more on him with next week's question. And despite the warnings of Ulmo, things seemed to be going well for Gondolin. Unfortunately, that was not going to last. At the end of the tale of the children of Húrin, Húrin himself was finally released from captivity. And he wandered, old and broken, and having nowhere to go, and he remembered the city of Gondolin he had lived in when he was young. And he searched for it, having only an idea of where it had been, since he had only ever come and gone via Eagleback, and eventually he finds the dry stream bed. But since the way had been blocked, he could not enter in. And the eagles of Thorondor spotted Húrin and told Turgon, but Turgon was afraid that Húrin had been released expressly for the purpose of using him to find Gondolin, so he refused to send the eagles to bring him there or to open the way in. And Tolkien wrote what happened next. Then he cried aloud in the wilderness, heedless of any ears, and he cursed the pitiless land, and standing at last upon a high rock, he looked towards Gondolin and called in a great voice, Turgon, Turgon, remember the fen of Serech! O Turgon, will you not hear in your hidden halls? But there was no sound save the wind in the dry grasses. Even so they hissed in Serech at the sunset, he said. And as he spoke, the sun went behind the mountains of shadow, and a darkness fell about him, and the wind ceased, and there was silence in the waste. Yet there were ears that heard the words that Húrin spoke, and report of all came soon to the dark throne in the north. And Morgoth smiled, for he knew how clearly in what region Turgon dwelt, though because of the eagles no spy of his could yet come within sight of the land behind the encircling mountains. But even with all of that knowledge, Morgoth couldn't enter it because the mountains blocked everything, and dragons were wingless at this point, so they couldn't fly over, and the eagles would usually swoop down and kill any spies that were in the area. But one day, Maeglin, who was always looking for reasons to not be around Tuor and Idril, he was exploring deep in the mountains for ore when he discovered a secret way out of the mountains. And Tolkien wrote, Thus it came to pass, as fate willed, that Maeglin was taken prisoner by orcs and brought to Angband. Maeglin was no weakling or craven, but the torment wherewith he was threatened cowed his spirit, and he purchased his life and freedom by revealing to Morgoth the very place of Gondolin and the ways whereby it might be found and assailed. Great indeed was the joy of Morgoth, and to Maeglin he promised the lordship of Gondolin as his vassal, and the possession of Idril Celebrimbor when the city should be taken. And indeed, desire for Idril and hatred for Tuor led Maeglin to the easier to his treachery, most infamous in all the histories of the Elder Days. And so Morgoth sends Maeglin back to Gondolin. He tells him, you just wait. And there comes a night when the people of Gondolin were celebrating a festival to welcome the dawn of midsummer. But Tolkien tells us that the light came not from the east, but from the north, as into the valley poured a great army of Balrogs, dragons, and orcs. And what's described next in the Silmarillion is just snippets, but there are earlier drafts of the story that Tolkien never got around to updating, and thus they were left out of the Silmarillion by Christopher. So they're not technically canon, but I'm going to include elements of it because I like it. So as the army is advancing towards Gondolin, the smooth rock of the hill that the city was built on, it was initially enough to hold the attackers off, because it's this smooth rock covered in flowing waters from the various fountains within the city. But the heat of the fires of the dragons and Balrogs evaporated most of the water. And then Gothmog, captain of the Balrogs, led the charge within. And when this happened, simultaneously, Maeglin and his followers, because he did have followers in the city, turned on the other soldiers of Gondolin. And Maeglin himself made his way to Idril to capture her and kill Eärendil, who was then only 7 years old. Tuor arrives just as he's about to stab Eärendil, and the two fight this fierce battle. And in the end, Tuor defeated Maeglin, pushing him to the very edge of the city, and then he lifts Maeglin up and hurls him over the side, and Maeglin dies in a near-identical way as his father, Eöl. Meanwhile, the battle is not going well, and the forces of Turgon are being slowly driven back through the city, and many of them, including Turgon, get hemmed into the Tower of the King. And in the center of the city, Ecthelion, captain of Turgon's guards and lord of the fountain, fought Gothmog. And Gothmog, he grievously wounds Ecthelion, and he's about to deliver the finishing blow when Ecthelion leapt at Gothmog, and he stabs him in the chest with the point of his helmet, which was topped with this sharp spike. And Gothmog falls back into the Fountain of the King with Ecthelion crushed against him. And the flames of Gothmog were extinguished in the waters, and they both drowned. And Turgon, seeing the ruin of his city, he removed his crown, and urged his people to take Tuor as their new king. Then he climbed the stairs to the top of the Tower of the King, and declared in a loud voice that carried throughout the city, "Great is the victory of the Noldor!" And then all of the attention of Morgoth's armies turned to the king's tower. And the defense from those within, not least Turgon himself, it was fierce, but in the end, dragons came, and they tore the tower down, and all those within died. Afterwards, the city was put to fire, and everything was destroyed. And the fire and the smoke of that ruination actually aided Tuor, Idril, Eärendil, and the not insignificant number of refugees, as it gave them cover when they fled. You see, Idril had never trusted Maeglin, and for years she had this growing sense of doom, and so she had ordered that a secret tunnel, like a secret escape way, would be made through the mountains, and no one but her most trusted advisors knew of it, so Maeglin was unable to give up its location to Morgoth. But Morgoth had sent patrols over the mountains, and a troop of orcs managed to find the path, and a Balrog came with them. This is how it's described in the Silmarillion. Then dreadful was their plight, and hardly would they have been saved by the valor of yellow-haired Glorfindel, chief of the House of the Golden Flower of Gondolin, had not Thorondor come timely to their aid. Many are the songs that have been sung of the duel of Glorfindel and the Balrog upon a pinnacle of rock in that high place, and both fell to ruin in the abyss. But the elves coming stooped down upon the orcs, and drove them shrieking back, and all were slain or cast into the deeps, so that rumor of the escape from Gondolin came not until long after to Morgoth's ears. Then Thorondor bore up Glorfindel's body out of the abyss, and they buried him in a mound of stones beside the pass, and a green turf came there, and yellow flowers bloomed upon it amid the barrenness of stone, until the world was changed. And so the refugees, they escape, and they make their way south, and they're joined with the refugees of another kingdom, those who had escaped the destruction of Doriath. And Doriath had not been destroyed by the forces of Morgoth, but by the sons of Feanor, as they sought to reclaim the Silmaril that Beren and Luthien had stolen from Morgoth's crown. But that is a story for another day. And I want to end by addressing the last part of Brian's question, which is, what is the legacy of the story of Gondolin on the rest of the Lord of the Rings? And I don't think it's hyperbole to say that without Gondolin, there is no Lord of the Rings. It's been said that the reason Tolkien wrote all of these stories is because he wanted to make up languages and he needed a world for them to live in. Well, the first story he wrote for his languages to walk around in was The Fall of Gondolin. It was written in 1916 when the 24-year-old Tolkien was recovering from trench fever after the Battle of the Somme in World War I. And much as he would later claim that none of his writing is allegorical, it's hard not to draw a line between the carnage of one of the bloodiest battles of the war and the most graphically described battles in all of his works. And also in that first draft, he described mechanical dragons that could transport the orcs and spat fire, which again, tanks had just been developed. This seems like a guy trying to process through writing the things he had seen. Now, he would drop those mechanical dragons in his later rewrites, but The Fall of Gondolin became the foundation for everything else he would write. The Valar, Morgoth, the Silmarils, the different tribes of elves, pretty much everything we've talked about in this entire podcast can find its root there. I sometimes do wonder if that's the reason that he had such a hard time rewriting it and finishing it, because, what are the butterfly effects going to be? If he changes something in the story that he had built his whole world around, what does he do then? But I would say that one thing that is not mentioned and didn't exist in most of these stories at all is hobbits. You see, hobbits were not originally part of Tolkien's legendarium. nor were they even like an intentional creation. In an interview with the BBC in 1972, Tolkien recalled, "I was doing the dull work of correcting exam papers when I came upon a blank page someone had turned in, a boon to all exam markers. I turned it over and wrote on the back, 'In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.' I'd never heard or used the word before." And so he expands on this little doodle scribble of "in the hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." Well, he's got young kids at home, so he starts making up bedtime stories for them, which, again, he never intended to write down and turn into a story. But his son Christopher, he wrote in the foreword of The Hobbit, "On one occasion I interrupted. Last time you said Bilbo's front door was blue, and you said Thorin had a golden tassel on his hood, but you've just said that Bilbo's front door was green, and that Thorin's hood was silver." At which point my father muttered, "Damn the boy," and then strode across the room to his desk to make a note. So the only reason The Hobbit was written down at all is because Christopher was really good at paying attention to details. And because it was just a story he was telling his kids at first, he never initially meant it to turn it into this worldwide phenomenon. And so he decides to sprinkle little things in there for his own amusement. The swords that Gandalf and Thorin find in the Troll Hoard, Orcust and Glamdring, are said to have come from Gondolin, and Glamdring was actually Turgon's personal sword. And Tolkien had also been continually developing the Silmarillion in the background, and he had recently come up with the character of Elrond as the son of Eärendil in some of his writings, and since elves are immortal, he figured, well, he could be around whenever this takes place. I'll just chuck him in The Hobbit, too. And then the publishers of The Hobbit, Allen and Unwin, they asked him for a sequel. And when they did that, these elements that had just been thrown in there for Tolkien's own amusement gave him the basis to pivot from fairy tale towards the high fantasy style that he preferred. He actually initially asked if, instead of doing a Hobbit sequel, he could just write the Silmarillion and then maybe do a sequel to that. But the people demanded hobbits, so he wrote them into this larger, grander story, threw in some stuff with Sauron, made Aragorn a direct descendant of Beren and Luthien, and suddenly modern fantasy as a genre was born, all thanks to the story of Gondolin, written by a soldier in his early 20s in a war hospital. So, there you go, Brian. I hope that between this week and last week, I answered your question. I'm pretty sure, I'll have to look at the numbers, but I'm fairly certain that this is going to be our longest episode ever, despite the fact that I tried to split the story over 2 shows. And as a little look ahead to next week, I'm actually going to be continuing the story again because someone submitted a question about Eärendil. Now, I think that one is going to be able to be a standalone episode, but we'll see. And if you, like Brian, want to submit a question, you can email in to lotramapod@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to answer it. Find me on all sorts of socials. I've got an Instagram, a Threads account, a YouTube channel. I don't know, maybe by the time this goes live, I'll start a Blue Sky, I guess. Why not? Links for all of that, along with a Patreon interest survey, is below. And make sure you tell your friends about the show, share it around, leave a 5-star rating and review, subscribe, all of that good stuff. Thank you, as always, to Michael for our music and Lauren for our artwork. And that's all for this week. Iluvatar willing, I'll be back next week. See you then.